Great. Well, hello everyone. Good evening. Welcome and thank you for coming. For those of you who may not know me yet, I'm Maria Capriola. I'm the tab manager here in Simsbury and started at the end of January. It was really important to me to offer this training as a refresher course for folks or for people who may be new staff members or new members of our boards and commissions. I thought this training would be really helpful and want to thank the Board of Selectmen for being supportive of my efforts for open and transparent government. And this was actually an established goal for me during my 18-month period to have Tom come out and to do a training session with you all. So again, many thanks to our board members who are here for supporting this initiative. I wanted to introduce folks to Tom Hennick. He is with the Freedom of Information Commission. Tom and I have known each other for quite a long time. He is an excellent resource at the FOIC. He is their public education officer, and he will often come out to communities and do this workshop with folks. And so really, it's the nuts and bolts of the FOI. It sort of condenses what's most important probably to you all in your work of supporting our various boards and committees or serving on our various boards and committees. So again, many thanks to Tom for coming
You're
out.
welcome.
And I hope you enjoy the session.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
All right. Hello, Simsbury. How's it going? We really enjoy doing these sessions because it means that you're interested in doing things the right way. We don't intend them to be, sessions where we beat you up and make you miserable. The idea is to try to answer some questions as we go along. So if I say something, you say, wait a minute, that's not how I understood it, stop. We'll answer the questions. Try to make it interactive. Try to make it as informal as possible. But the idea, again, is to make it easier for you to work with freedom of information and not to find yourself banging your head against the wall when an FOI issue comes up. I always like to tell people a little bit about me before we start. I am not an attorney. Is that good news or bad news? The reason I share that is that I'm not going to be able to give you any binding legal opinions. Again, this is not about orders or commands. The goal is to try to teach, to try to help, to give you the tools to work with when you have a freedom of information issue to deal with. Before I joined FOI, I'm in my 18th year there. Yikes. I was a journalist. Is that good news or bad news? The reason I share that is that I have seen FOI maybe a little differently than some of my colleagues and some of the other people who deal with it. I've kind of been on both sides of the issue. As Maria mentioned, I spend most of my time at the office when I'm there answering questions on the phone, answering emails. And by the way, you now have a face to put with the voice on the other end. Do not ever hesitate to pick up the phone and call. I have witnesses who will tell you that I will call you back. You might get voicemail because I'm on the phone that much, but I will call you back, and I'll try to get you an answer. It may not be the answer you want, but again, that's not an order either. It's just an attempt to try to help you through a situation that might arise. So I've seen, sometimes even been the questioner, and now I'm answering the question, so it's kind of a broader scope than some of my colleagues. Now let me just see a show of hands. How many of you are volunteer members of boards? Pretty fair number. So you get your hefty salaries and you go to Joe Pizza or Plan B and they embrace you. A lot of times I go out and do these sessions, people say, Tom, you don't get it. We're volunteers. We didn't sign up for this FOI stuff. We signed up to help Simsbury, to bring the tax rate down, to help the kids get educated. Well, I get that too. I really do get that. For 10 years in my town, I was a member of a board, chairman for the last 5, and then I got out, enough is enough. And last October they said, one of the selectmen is moving out of town. Would you mind taking his spot till the end of the next term? So when I dash out of here tonight, you know where I'm going? The Board of Selectmen's meeting. But I get it, because you live your life and then you have sort of a second full-time job sometimes, especially if you're on a Board of Finance or a Board of Education, it's budget time. I get it. And you have to understand that freedom of information has to be a part of that because it's the law in the state of Connecticut. And my board has somebody who knows a little bit about it. Some boards have people who are fresh, brand new to it and don't really. And again, the idea would be that those of you who are on boards give you a little more knowledge, a little more concept of how it works, and maybe you'll be more comfortable with FOI going forward. This law in Connecticut is 43 years old. It was Ella Grasso's brainchild when she ran for governor for the first time. And if you do the math, 43 years ago puts us right smack in the middle of Watergate. So you had a country that was in turmoil, a country that was worried about government behind closed doors, secret government, lack of transparency. And she was in Congress. Ella was in Congress when Watergate kind of exploded all around us. And she said, one of the things I'm going to do if I do run for governor is to get some sort of an open government law for our state. And as you know, she ran and she won. And one of the first things she did in 1975 was put forward this concept of an open government law. And it was really important to her. And it was so important to her that she said, this law is so important to our state, I will see to it, I will guarantee that it is approved unanimously by our legislature. Have you ever watched the legislature? Right? Can you imagine guaranteeing a unanimous vote on that or on anything? Well, folks, she guaranteed it and she got it. I have seen a video. There was not a single no vote in the House, not a single no vote in the Senate. This law passed unanimously. Now that shows you how important it was then and how important it remains today. But it also gives you a little insight as to why we have to have conversations like this. If you're at all politically savvy or if you follow politics, you say, okay, how did they do that? How did they get everybody to vote yes? Well, they had to negotiate. And there was a lot of back and forth and a lot of, arm twisting, hand wringing, so that everybody would vote yes. And so what you've got is a law that's based on a really simple, easy concept. Open up government. Government entities are open, available, accessible. But then when you read it, I know some of you have tried to read it. Have you tried to read it? Your eyes roll to the back of your head. The wherefore and the whereas and the wherefores and oh my God. Well, to get there, they had to negotiate. So they got a simple concept that maybe has some gray areas in it. And what that means is that those of you who are on the front line have to be able to interpret it, sometimes on a daily basis. Those of you who are staff, you know what I'm talking about. Well, gee, what does that really mean? I know it's about open government, but it says here, well, maybe I don't have to give that record out, or maybe we shouldn't be in executive session. And you've got to make decisions. Hence, a meeting like tonight to give you some ideas, some tools as to how to work with the law, so when it comes time to make those decisions, you're better able to do it. One of the first things I always tell people is that a lot of people think that this law is about free information. How many of you who are staffers especially have people have come into the office and say, under freedom of information, you got to tell me this. Why were there cruisers in my neighborhood last night? How did they arrive at that budget figure? Well, why are they doing this? Well, we're all public servants and we'll answer questions, but one of the first things to tell people is it's not about that. It's not about free information. It's about access. Access to public meetings and access to public records. And in a minute we'll go through both components of that and try to give you some of the basics. But if that's ever been an issue for you, people saying, freedom of information, tell me this, tell me that, I want you to think for a minute about working at the Freedom of Information Commission. People think that we are the information center for the entire state of Connecticut. You should sit where I sit sometimes and answer some of those phone calls. First of all, they think that we're in this giant vault, which holds every record held by every entity in the entire state, and we get questions all the time. Send me this, send me that. So I have to explain to them. I say, no, we're not a repository for records. And most people, they kind of get it, but let me share with you. People say, Tom, you should stop doing the FOI workshops. You should start doing some stand-up, because you got all these things. But let me share a couple with you to show you what can happen. This guy writes, this is just last week, and he writes this thing, and I'm still not sure what he was asking for. And he's writing and he says, know ye all that declaration of trust, bond, affidavit of material truth and facts, relinquishment, blah, blah, blah. Bottom line is he's asking for some City of Hartford police record, and he wants us to get it for him. But he's asking us like we could push the button and get it to him. So I have this standard thing, in Connecticut, the Freedom of Information Commission is not a repository for records. You got to write to the. So most people, like I said, they write back and they say thanks. His response: first of all, it's addressed to Mr. Thomas, so I'm not sure he's on it yet. Your agency keeps saying my request, written in English, are confusing, so I must seek a legal remedy to get them from your state agency, since your agency is the one blocking me from getting them, the other depositories that have them. So how do I answer that? Anybody want to help me with that one? No, right. Dear sir, please provide an electronic copy via email, preferably a spreadsheet, showing all the Medicaid paid electroconvulsive treatments, aka ECT, aka shock treatment. My request includes every field you have available, but certainly not patient identifiers. This request includes, but is not limited to, the name of the psychiatrist, license number, date of treatment, age of patient, city, county, name of treatment facility, address of facility, cost of treatment, etc. Those of you who fill records requests will like the next line. Time frame, as far back as your computer records exist. Best regards, Ken Kramer, psychsearch.net. Anybody want to help me with that one? And so first of all, I don't know what he wants. So I write back, I said, look, you gotta find who has these records, if anybody does in Connecticut, and you gotta ask them. His response, well then, be a good public servant and get it into the correct hands instead of just blowing it off. Best regards, Ken Kramer, psychsearch.net. One more. Last summer. Hi. The 1108 Whitney Avenue has a big board in the middle of the pavement. Makes a concern about possible risk of injury for both traffic or pedestrian. Please help to remove the board immediately because of heavy traffic. We cannot move. Thanks. So Freedom of Information is responsible for driving down to Hamden or New Haven, wherever that is on Whitney Avenue, and moving the board so traffic can move. You got to get people to understand what it's not. And you'd think after 43 years that wouldn't be a problem, but it still is. So, when your people come to you and start asking you questions or saying, don't I have a right to know this? You might have a right to know it, but you've got to attend the meeting where it's going to happen. Or you've got to look at the records and do a little work for yourself to find the information that you need. So I said it's about meetings and it's about records. And I don't read a lot of definitions, but those of you who work with the meeting provisions, I want you to just hear the words. Meeting means any hearing or other proceeding of a public agency. Any convening or assembly of a quorum of a multi-member public agency, and any communication by or to a quorum of a multi-member public agency, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, to discuss or act upon a matter over which the public agency has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. Bottom line, folks, is any time your board gathers in any way, shape, or fashion to do its work, consider it a meeting. Make sure it's properly noticed. Make sure it's open to the public. And make sure there are minutes to that meeting when the meeting is done. All too often people say to me, well, Tom, it was just a little informal gathering. We were just talking about a few things, just to get them out of the way. It was just a little workshop. It was just a little, informal stuff. Doesn't matter. You want to call a task force. You want to call it something, that's fine. It's a meeting, you need to know. Yes, sir.
So two members of a commission or a board get together at the supermarket and start talking about the case they answered the other night.
Right.
Not a quorum, because it's only two.
Okay. I want you to hold the thought. The question was two members of a board talking, because I'm going to hit that issue in about 30 seconds. People say, in fact, I got asked before we even started tonight, well, we're going to form a little subcommittee. It's not the full board. Doesn't matter. Subcommittees are public agencies unto themselves. When you read the definition of public agency, which is what this law applies to, it's got a phrase in there that says, including any committee of or created by. So if you create that 3-member task force, it's a public agency and it needs to follow the same rules. The quorum issue comes up a lot. It wasn't a quorum, do we need to worry? And when I hear we need to worry, I get nervous, because that means people are trying to work around. Now, I don't want you to shoot the messenger on this one, but I'm here to tell you that as we stand here today or sit here today, even absent a quorum, you could be having a meeting under Freedom of Information. There is an appellate court ruling in Connecticut that says if you do not have a quorum, it is not a meeting under FOI. There is also an appellate court ruling in Connecticut that says if you do not have a quorum, you are still having a meeting under FOI. I can't make it up. So the appellate court has basically told us diametrically opposed things. So when people ask that question, I have to say you want to be really careful, because even absent a quorum, it could be a meeting. The most recent case in that comes to us out of Meriden. They had a small group of their council that was not a quorum, intentionally not a quorum, sitting in a room talking about a search committee for a new town manager. And the reporter from the Meriden paper walked in the room. Now, message to everybody, when the reporter walks in, don't just say, get out, which is what they did. So that set off bells, and the reporter said, what are they trying to hide? And filed a complaint and said they were in there, they were doing something important. The complaint goes to the FOI Commission. The Commission rules in favor of the reporter and says that was a meeting, that was clearly work. Their contention that just because it wasn't a quorum, it was okay, went nowhere. They appealed that ruling, and the Superior Court has upheld the FOI Commission decision. They are appealing it to that same appellate court, so stay tuned. But as we stand here right now, even absent a quorum, you could be having a meeting. So you want to be careful the extent to which you talk to board members outside of the arena of having a board meeting. Yes?
You familiar with the Brown Act in California?
I'm not familiar with the Brown Act.
It's about the number of people meeting anyway. If you're out to dinner together and it's a number of city council members there, it becomes a meeting. It's nothing like that in Connecticut.
There's nothing like that in Connecticut, and this law applies only to Connecticut. So there are situations where you could go out to dinner and it's not a problem, but in this case, it's not an issue. Yes, sir.
If you have like a chance meeting where people talk, can you get ahead of it by saying, "Oh, I'll write up the meetings for this, minutes for this meeting," and put it in?
The question is, can you? And I'm repeating the questions, by the way, for the TV. The question is, can you create? That helps a little bit, but the meeting wasn't noticed, and the problem is it's not noticed, so that could be an issue. Okay, so you just want to be careful the extent to which those conversations go on. Now, I always like to say, where did the best meetings in Connecticut take place? I would argue in the parking lot after the meeting, right? Let's not be naive. Let's be realistic. Those conversations are going to take place. The dinner is going to take place. The two people meeting at the supermarket. But folks, be cognizant of the fact that the law wants you to do your work in public. And if you're having that deliberative conversation that you should be having here, you're exposing yourself to the possibility of a complaint. And I should have mentioned that, by the way, one of the things that law in 1975 did was create the FOI Commission, and the Commission is in a position where it needs to adjudicate situations where people believe they've been denied access. So if the wrong people see your two folks having that conversation and file a complaint, the complaint comes to the FOI Commission. The Commission tries to mediate it if we can, but absent that, you go to a hearing and the Commission issues a ruling. But because of some of those gray areas that I mentioned before, even FOI Commission decisions get challenged or questioned because they're based on the Commission's interpretation, and an appeal can go all the way to the state Supreme Court. So you just, again, you want to keep yourself in a position where you're doing the right thing, that you want to be careful. The law talks to us about 3 different kinds of meetings. It talks to us about a regular meeting, a special meeting, and an emergency meeting. The regular meeting is a meeting that you have per a schedule that you submit to your town hall the end of January of every year. It says we meet on the 1st and 3rd Tuesday, the 2nd and 4th Wednesday, 7 o'clock town hall, 8 o'clock library, whatever that is, that's your regular meeting schedule. People see special meeting and they get very nervous. They say, what's special about a special meeting? Well, really, the only thing is that it's not at your regular place and time. The difference between the regular and the special meeting is not very great. For both of those, you have to prepare an agenda that needs to be available at least 24 hours in advance. Anybody here responsible for agendas? Have to put them together. When you do them, try to be as specific as possible. The idea behind the agenda is to make sure that the public is fairly apprised as to what's going to happen at that meeting. You make it available 24 hours in advance. That means in your board's office, if there is one, and the town clerk's office. And there are, a lot of people use websites now. The only legal requirement for agenda postings on websites is that special meeting. You don't really have to put one up for a regular meeting, but most people do. I'd encourage you to continue doing that. The fundamental difference between the regular and the special meeting is that at a regular meeting, should something arise that's not on that agenda, you can add it to the agenda by a 2/3 vote of those board members who are present. And at a special meeting, you can't. So when I talked about specificity for agendas, especially with a special meeting, it's really important. You want to make sure that you've got everything you're going to talk about on there, because you can't add anything to the agenda. So if you put an item on an agenda like other business or old business or new business, it's kind of okay for a regular meeting because the chairman can say, is there any other business? And a member can say, yes, Madam Chairman, I'd like to add such and such. You make a motion, you vote, you add it. But at a special meeting, you can't. So if it says other business or old business at a special meeting, you might as well take it off unless you've got a specific item underneath. The emergency meeting. Folks, the emergency meeting is a meeting that I really discourage you from using. It's an unnoticed meeting. And the problem is that what you and I think might be an emergency might not rise to that level in the eyes of the law. Every Tuesday, after a day like Columbus Day, I'll get a phone call from somewhere. Somebody in the state will say, Tom, we've got a problem. It happened just earlier this month. Maybe, 3 weeks ago? Tom, we got a problem. What's the problem? Our selectmen are meeting tonight, and we always put the agenda in on Monday, but we forgot that the town hall was closed yesterday for Columbus Day. So we put it in this morning and everything's okay, right? Well, do the math. That's not 24 hours. That's a problem. I tell them that. They said, well, we've got too much to do, it's an emergency, so we're going to call it an emergency meeting. Oops, I forgot, it's not an emergency. You know, in our minds, as volunteers, it may feel like one, but it's not. My advice under those circumstances is always to wait. At least 24 hours, you're in much better shape. Somebody could challenge it. A lot of people say, well, what's the big deal? I have a longish story which I'll brief down just to give you an example. You know, what could happen? Big deal, we didn't notice the meeting. A couple years ago over in Ridgefield, there was a situation where the assistant fire chief believed he was about to become the next chief, and then he found out that the rumor was false. And he got into a real loud argument with the first selectman, screaming, yelling, cursing, you know, to the point where first selectman had to calm him down and say, you're not going to be the next chief. We're going in a different direction. But I tell you what, we'll make you the interim chief while we look for a new chief. He's not happy about that, but he goes off. Well, your town, my town, Ridgefield, small towns. It doesn't take very long. The word of this fight gets all over town in no time. And the selectman's getting emails and texts and phone calls. This is horrible. This is terrible. He's insubordinate. He was threatening to you. He was a danger to you. I guess it must have been a real doozy of an argument. First selectman starts thinking about it and says, you know, there may be some truth to that. And he decides he's going to talk to his board about it. So the next day, which is a Saturday, he calls an emergency unnoticed meeting of his board. The emergency being that there was a threat. And they said, you know what? He's no good, we're going to fire him. So they fire him at this emergency meeting on a Saturday morning. Then they have to go find him because he's not around, it's a Saturday. And I guess he was like cleaning out his gutters or something, and they bring him to town hall. He looks horrible. Thanks for coming in, you're fired. He gets mad all over again. He says, you blankety blank blank blanks, you can't fire me because I quit. So they reconvene the emergency meeting and accept his resignation. Now, remember what I said about filing complaints. The guy thinks about it and he says, what was the emergency? Why didn't they notice this meeting? I'm going to file a complaint. I think that this was a violation of the FOI Act. So he files a complaint. It wasn't one we could mediate, I'll tell you that. And the commission found in favor of the complainant and said there was no emergency there, and invoked one of its strongest penalties. It doesn't do it very often, but when it feels there's been a particularly egregious violation, it jumps in and declared null and void everything that happened at that meeting. Which means now that he was fired and or quit at a meeting that basically didn't happen. End of story. Except Ridgefield didn't like the decision and appealed it all the way to the state Supreme Court. Now you know that's not a snap of the fingers, you know, time frame. So 6 to 7 years later, it gets before the Supreme Court, and the court upholds the decision of the FOI Commission and also declares null and void what happened at that meeting. Is the HR person in the room? Think about the nightmare of trying to figure out how much back pay you owe that guy. 6 to 7 years he's not on the payroll. There were also some rumors about you know, health care that he might have had, but he didn't have because there was confusion about his status. They may have owed him money on that. Think of the legal bills, all because they didn't wait 24 hours. Is this an extreme example of what could happen? Yes. But if that little bird is going off in your head saying, we don't need to worry about FOI this time. If the wrong person files the complaint, it could put you in a vulnerable situation that you don't want to deal with. If you ever have an emergency, which you might, you know, people say, well, what would be an emergency? You know, I hate to get dramatic. Life and death is a little strong, but a serious situation. Now, the best example that I have, you know, I could conjure up happened maybe 3 or 4 years ago, maybe even longer, when we had that winter where it seemed like we got 2 feet of snow every 5 minutes, you know, and the flat roofs on a lot of the municipal buildings in the schools were starting to sag. And, you know, a couple of boards looked up and said, uh-oh, and needed to act not 24 hours from now, but now, to move money around, to get professionals up there to get that snow off to avoid a real disaster. That was an emergency. Keeping people safe, keeping people out of harm's way. If you ever have one of those and you need to, and again, if you can avoid it, I would recommend it. You have your meeting, you talk about only that emergency situation, and within 72 hours you create minutes that reflect what the emergency was, who was there, and what you did about it. Now, I stress sticking to the topic. There's a couple situations where you're together legally and you're supposed to stay on one topic. Well, you know, as long as we're here, we have other stuff to work on, don't do it. Stick to the topic emergency topic, and then move on. Remember, folks, that your meetings are open to the public. Anybody can come. Hey, you're from Avon. What are you doing here? No, you can't. Anybody can come. Anybody can audio or videotape a meeting. Has that ever been an issue for anybody? That was written, way back when, but it envisioned those bulky, heavy TV cameras so that you couldn't kick them out. But today, everybody, one of the things I don't like about that piece is that you don't have to be told that somebody's recording. I mean, every one of you could have a recorder on your lap with a phone or something. I wouldn't know it. So if you're on a board, my recommendation is to always assume that somebody's got a recording device going, because it's perfectly legal and anybody can do it. The law does not guarantee anybody the right to speak at a public meeting, and a lot of people think that it does. It gives you the right to attend, the right to observe, but public speaking, public comment, public participation not required under FOI. Now, you may have things in your different bylaws, in your charters. I don't know. But if you stand up one day and say, you know what, I'm tired of you people, nobody's talking, you may get run out of town, but you wouldn't be violating FOI. There's no requirement that public speaking be allowed at a meeting. That tool can be helpful if you've got a situation where you've got a full house, you've got a very busy night, and you want to say, if we let everybody go on and on and on, we'll never get done, so we're going to impose a 3-minute limit or 5-minute limit or something like that. This law is open enough so that you can do that. My recommendation is that if you're going to do something like that, be consistent. You get 3 minutes, you get 2, you get 1. That's not a good idea. Say, okay, everybody, 3 minutes. That's it. That's what we're going to do. There are ways that boards and commissions can exclude the public from conversations. The legislature tried to give boards, a little bit of balance so that everything didn't have to be done in public. Have we all heard of the term executive session? Remember, folks, that an executive session is a portion of a publicly noticed open meeting. It is not something that sits on an island by itself. So even if you've got a meeting and the only item is an executive session item, you need to notice that meeting, you need to convene in public, you make a motion to go into executive session, you go in, you converse, you take whatever time you need to talk about the issue, and then you must come out to vote. All action needs to be in the public. You can't take any action behind closed doors. You come out, you vote, so the minutes reflect convened at 7 o'clock, voted to go into executive session for one of the 5 reasons, which I'll go over in a second. Go in, discuss, come back out, and vote. Adjourned. But you must have it as a notice meeting, even if no business is really conducted in public. 5 reasons for an executive session. A personnel matter, pending claims or pending litigation, a security matter, a property transaction. Let's suppose you're on a school building committee that's looking to build a new school, and you have to purchase the property first before you put the school up. So you could have those kinds of conversations and negotiations, looking over real estate appraisals and things like that. You could do that behind closed doors, because you wouldn't have to negotiate that in public. You could do that behind closed doors. The 5th one, the last one, is what we call something of a catch-all. It allows a board or commission to have a conversation about a document or documents that it believes are exempt from disclosure. Anybody on a board that deals with bids or RFPs, there's an exemption for bids. And the law says that you're allowed to withhold the content of bid packages or RFPs until you've actually signed the contract or decided you're done with the project, you're not, or you're going to rebid it or something like that. Section 1-210B24. It's frightening that I know that, isn't it? But, okay, so you collect the bids, you're not sharing them with anybody, so you could go into executive session to talk about their content. You ask your attorney for a written legal opinion. You are the client. The written legal opinion is covered by the attorney-client privilege. You're not going to share it with anybody else. You would go into executive session to talk about the content of that written document from your attorney. How are we going to deal with this written advice? The personnel executive session. Folks, first of all, do not just say executive session personnel. Our commission and our courts have come down particularly hard to say that's not enough information. Now, you don't necessarily have to name the individual who's going to be talked about. Executive session plan, discussion of a teacher. Executive session plan, discussion of a town hall employee, discussion of a public works employee. You don't necessarily have to name the person, but you've got to give the public some idea about what's coming. You also have to tell the individual that he or she is going to be discussed in an executive session. That person then has the right, under the law, to come forward and say, no, I don't want an executive session. I want that discussion to be held in front of everybody. I want it done publicly. And if the person says that and sticks to that, you cannot go into executive session. I've seen multiple boards say, oh, the heck with that, we're going in anyway. That's a problem. The person's right is to have it discussed in public. What people get confused about is they say, okay, I don't want it in public, but damn it, you're going to talk about me, I get to be in the room. And think about it, intuitively that makes sense, but that's not what the law says. The law says you have a right to that discussion in public, but not necessarily the right to demand to enter the executive session. Now, sometimes boards invite people in, and that's okay. Boards can invite anybody they want into an executive session to give evidence, to give testimony, to use their expertise. But it's up to the board. And I've seen a lot of employees just sort of flummoxed by the fact that they weren't invited in. And that's just not what the law allows. Yes?
Regarding RFPs, sometimes you see proprietary information sections. What makes the determination?
Okay.
What's the limits of it?
Question was about proprietary information in an RFP. We jump ahead a little bit to the records provision, but you asked the question, it's a good one. The idea, folks, is that it's your decision. As once that RFP or that whatever package it is crosses the threshold and becomes a property of a town of Simsbury board or public agency, they've pointed out the possibility of proprietary information or trade secrets, but it's your call. So if somebody wants it, you say, okay, thank you very much to the person who gives you the record, but now it's our call, what goes forward. Yes, sir?
Tom, so therefore, in an RFP, let's say you get 5 RFPs that come in.
Uh-huh.
We're sitting in the building committee. We have the right to go into executive session to discuss the qualifications of those 5 RFPs?
You have a right to talk about the content. The question was, do we have a right to discuss it? Yes. Executive session to talk about the content of those RFPs. And frankly, another thing that happens too is you want to invite the people who submitted them in to answer your questions about it. That would be okay too, because you're bringing them in for their expertise.
Can't be in there.
Right. You don't want them all in there because then you've created a second audience, and that's sort of pointless. Yes?
If you were having an executive session to discuss something that's not for public knowledge at that time, but you need to move into a public session to hold the vote, how do you arrange your motion to still protect what was discussed in the executive session?
In fact, did everybody hear that? Great question. How do you've got something that you clearly have a right to discuss in public, but you need to take action on it? You got to be a little bit clever. That's a great question. Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve the action that we discussed for security reasons behind closed doors. Second, all in favor? I mean, at some point it may come out, but you've talked about it, you've decided what you're going to do, but you make that action in public. It comes up sometimes when the executive session for a personnel matter, you're hiring somebody. And the board says, we want to vote on, we've reviewed all 3 candidates, we want to vote. But you can't really vote until you ask the person if they're going to take the job. So I move, Mr. Chairman, that we vote to pursue candidate A or something, so you got to be a little creative. Okay? So the executive session for pending claims and pending litigation is pretty much what it sounds like. There has to be a lawsuit. There has to be, a grievance, something like that, and you're going in to talk about your strategy. Do I have land use people in the room? There's a tendency sometimes to say, if we approve that, we could get sued. That may be true, but that's not a reason for an executive session. There's got to be something more substantial than that. There's got to be even, what do we call them? I work with an attorney who calls them saber rattling letters. If you stupid idiots approve that plan, we're going to sue you. That's enough. But just your thought that it might trigger a lawsuit wouldn't be enough. It also gives the board the opportunity to have a conversation about taking legal action. You could let's suppose you're on that building committee and one of your contractors isn't doing a job and you want to pull the bond. Well, you wouldn't have to talk about that in public. You could go behind closed doors and have that conversation as well. The security executive session, the last of the 5, that never used to come up. I used to have to really struggle to come up with an example just so that people would understand. But sadly, folks, since Sandy Hook in 2012, it's been, in our society today, it comes up more and more. Boards of education want to talk about increased security in their buildings, extra resource officers, alarm systems, things like that. Well, you wouldn't want to talk about that in public because the very people you're trying to keep away might be sitting there listening to what you're trying to do to keep them away. So you could have those kind of conversations behind closed doors. Just remember, you don't want to vote behind closed doors. It's very important to take your action in public. That's really important. Use executive session, use it wisely. I get questions a lot about people say, well, we just put one on the agenda just because, for a placeholder. Don't do it. If you're going to have one, fine. Put it down. But just to have it on there every time and you're not going to, there's no point to that. That would be somewhat disingenuous. So there's executive session as a way for the public not to be involved. And there's a second path that boards and commissions go down. And this is one of those that we're sure was part of the whole compromise thing back in 1975. I read you the definition of a meeting. The sentence that follows that says, meeting does not include. Meeting does not include. And then there follows a list of things, many of which everybody in this room would say, hey, that's a meeting. Well, the legislature said, fine, you can call it a meeting, but for the purposes of freedom of information, it's not a meeting. Has anybody ever heard the term the non-meeting? Has that made its way to Simsbury?
I'm using it.
Yeah, right? People have taken to calling these things non-meetings, which is somewhat mind-boggling when you think about it, because it feels like a meeting, but the non-meeting refers to the FOI part. So at the top of the list would be collective bargaining. Do we have unions in Simsbury? Has anybody ever had to do any collective bargaining? Anybody? It's as much fun as you've ever had in your life, right? You sit at a table all night long and here's my proposal, well, that's stupid, and here's your, and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. You are there forever, but nobody knows it. I mean, it's really important when you think about it. You're determining the financial future, in some cases, of a whole budget cycle, of a town, of a board, and you've got a situation where nobody knows because collective bargaining is not a meeting. And I've done those, and it takes a long time, and you're working. And think about going home after a 4-hour non-meeting and saying, honey, I'm home. I was at a non-meeting all night. It's kind of, but that's basically what it is. So collective bargaining, not a meeting. Executive level search committees. You're a police commission. Your chief retires, and you put together an executive level search committee to look for a new chief. Not covered by freedom of information. So the search committee operates outside of FOI and comes up with and all the resumes and all those things, not subject to FOI. Now that one, if you think about it, makes a little bit of sense. If you're filling a high level position, you're probably going to get applications from people who already have jobs and don't want their current employers to know. So that one kind of makes sense. But again, important work, but outside of FOI. You mentioned, before the quorum issue, meeting at the grocery store. A chance meeting, a dinner meeting, not meetings under FOI. But there's a catch. Neither planned nor intended for the purpose of discussing matters relating to official business. And I come back to my parking lot example. What the hell else are they going to talk about, right? Let's not be naive. But if you're doing that, if you're having dinner because you all get along so well, and board stuff comes up, keep it on the surface, folks. Don't make those big decisions. I like to say, don't set the budget over the eggnog at the Christmas party. Be smart about it. When you go out to dinner, when you have that dinner meeting, I guarantee you the one time that you sort of break the rule and have that passionate, deliberative conversation, the wrong person's sitting in the next booth and files a complaint. They did it in secret. You want to make sure you do your work in public. Now I know Simsbury is not a very political town, but there's also a provision for something called a caucus. which allows members of the same board and the same party to get together and talk about anything they want for as long as they want. So if your two people are of the same party on the same board, it's okay. This is a giant loophole in the idea of open government. We think this is one of the huge compromises that came forward in 1975. People said, gee, shouldn't that be a meeting? You got an 11-member board and 7 of them are the same party and they're sitting off in the room? Well, yeah, it could be. Where people get into trouble is they forget that it's only same board, same party. The Board of Education cannot ask the superintendent to come in. The Police Commission cannot ask the chief to come into a caucus, because then it's not a caucus anymore. It's not same board, same party. You had a question?
Are unaffiliated folks allowed to caucus with a party?
Are unaffiliated folks allowed to caucus? Yes, but they would have to declare. So if the unaffiliated voter wants to declare with the Dems, that's fine. You have to submit something to the town clerk that says, I am unaffiliated and caucusing with the Dems, and then you're locked in for the remainder of that term. Okay? That's how that would work. The last thing we should talk about with meetings before we move over to records are the minutes. Do I have any minutes people in the room? Several poor, unfortunate souls. I feel your pain. I do the FOI Commission meeting minutes. I get it. Here's my advice. Minutes need not be the recreation of War and Peace. They are not every word that everybody says. They are not transcripts of the meeting. Actually, the only thing that's required for minutes is a record of the votes. Who votes for what or for whom. Now, you're creating the historical record for Simsbury. You want more than that in there. But how much more is your call? It's not every word. I know there's not a, your town is good this way. People standing up and saying, I want it, blah, 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 I want every word of this. No. You put in the minutes what needs to be in the minutes so that 5 years from now, 6 years from now, I can pick them up and I can say, okay, I get what they were thinking. I got an email a couple months ago from the chairman of the Waterford East Lyme Shellfish Commission. And I had been down there to do one of these talks. And he says, we're having a problem with our minutes. They were putting in basically every word that everybody said, especially during public comment. So a Fred Wise approaches this commission, and the minutes say he requested a copy of the 15-month study noted in the DEP public hearing notice that was sent out to area homeowners. Stated the areas of Keeney Cove and Golden Spur waters are polluted, is against granting a project for NBSF when NBSF already has one in East Lyme's Niantic Bay. So Fred sees the minutes, and this is a list of things that he wants changed in the minutes, because I didn't really say that, I didn't really mean that. And by the way, it's sometimes even worse with board members. Oh, that sounds bad, I shouldn't say that. Can we take that out? So he says, I know minutes are not verbatim. How would you suggest we handle this going forward? Should we be more general in how we record public comment? Something like, Mr. Wise commented on the NBSF aquaculture project. Yes, you've gotten to the point. You don't have to hear everything that Mr. Wise has to say about the project. He's even mentioned in the minutes, and nothing says he has to be, and you move on from there. Nice, crisp, clear, concise minutes, and folks, that helps because the minutes need to be available to the public in 7 days. And if you're doing verbatim transcripts, you're going to be at it for a long time. Yes?
There is a time the public can come back and try to dispute the minutes, correct?
The public can dispute all it wants. The question was, does the public have a right to dispute? The public can dispute, but frankly, it's up to the board. There's nothing in the FOI. Now, you may have something in town, but the FOI Act gives the public no power to dispute the minutes. Before I jump over to records, are there any questions about things related to meetings that we didn't talk about? Yes?
What if, the local cable company is taping the event, but it's not going to be broadcast? Can people come in? Is there any kind of channel through that?
Okay, the question is the local cable company is broadcasting. That's the local cable company. Unless it's a town-owned cable company, it's up to the cable company. If the cable company wants to put it out, it can. Now, if the town is video recording, that becomes a public record that people could get copies of or take a look at. But if it's the cable companies, it's their property. The law only applies to public agencies. Yes, sir?
I thought there was a requirement that all the votes that were taken in a public meeting had to be posted in 48 hours.
Okay, the 48-hour question about votes, that's a good question. They don't necessarily have to be posted. they need to be available in 48 hours. It doesn't necessarily have to be a formal document, but I know you said you were land use. If I go into your land use office after 2 days, there should be a record somewhere where someone can say to me, here's how they voted 2 days ago. That's not necessarily a formal record, though. Yes, sir?
The minutes have to record how individuals vote?
Yes. The minutes need to it needs to be very specific as to who voted for what or for whom. My recommendation on that is at the top of the minutes, board members A, B, C, D, and E were present, so that if it's unanimous, you don't have to keep repeating their names. 5-1 with Jones opposed, then it's much easier to do it that way. So public records, which is the other piece of the FOI Act. I'm going to read you 2 pieces of a definition. Just sort of listen to the words. Public records or files means any recorded data or information relating to the conduct of the public's business. Prepared, owned, used, received, or retained by a public agency, or to which a public agency is entitled to receive a copy by law or contract, whether such data or information be handwritten, typed, tape recorded, printed, photostated, photographed, or recorded by any other method. Part 2. Except as otherwise provided by any federal law or state statute, all records maintained or kept on file by any public agency, whether or not such records are required by any law or by any rule or regulation, shall be public records, and every person shall have the right to inspect such records promptly during regular office or business hours, copy such records in accordance with 1-212, or receive a copy of such records in accordance with 1-212. What that law basically said to us is that every record held by every public agency in the state of Connecticut is defined as a public record. And in theory, anybody can come in and ask to see it, I'm fumbling with my papers here, or ask to get a copy. So if it's that simple, what are we worried about? Well, it's not that simple, in that on top of those base definitions, there are what we call in the Freedom of Information Act 3 E's. There are exceptions, there are exclusions, and there are exemptions to disclosure. Tom, why are you telling us that everything's a public record and then telling us that we have these things that take them off the table? Because all too often, folks, people forget that everything's a public record. We get possessive. They're zoning records, you can't have them. They're police records, you can't have them. They're town manager records, you can't have them. They're mine. Or we get selective. You look like a nice person. We'll give you the records. You not so much. You get nothing. And you used to be a reporter, you're out of here. You would think that after all these years, people got it. It's a public record first, and then we look at whether there's an exemption, not they're mine, you can't have them. But it persists to this day. I'm going to share a story with you, and because we are being recorded, I'll clean up the language, but you'll get the idea. The person making this particular request has been around the city of Hartford for a long time. He makes a lot of requests, and sometimes he gets on their nerves. Folks, I don't care if they get on your nerves. We get them too. Just as an aside, we have one guy who between 2011 and 2016 filed almost 450 complaints against various agencies around the state, to the point where we couldn't stand them anymore. We said, these are silly, they're frivolous, we're not going to hear them. That's one of the FOI Commission's strongest powers, but he was clearly just doing it to harass. But even when he comes in and asks for a record, separate from the complaints, if we have it, we have to ignore the fact that it's him coming in the door and see whether or not it's a record he has a right to have. So in this case, this guy is, we'll call him a quasi-journalist. He does a blog, he does a public access TV thing, and he's around a lot. They've had it, but he's still around a lot. In this particular instance, he says, I want 2 things. I want a record of bills submitted to the city by this law firm doing outside work for the city, and then a record of payment from the city to that law firm. So the Corporation Counsel, the attorney responsible for freedom of information in the city of Hartford, responds, I have your FOI request, and will coordinate the response. Such documentation as is allowed or required by law will be provided. Now, those of you who deal with the public and FOI requests, this is what is called kind of the 4-day response. If you get a request for records, you should always respond within 4 business days. And those of you who are on boards or commissions, if you get one, if you're not going to be giving the response, get to the right staff person who does, because the law says that if you don't respond in 4 business days, you've actually denied access to that record, and the person can file one of those complaints about you for not not making the records available. So at the very least, always respond in 4 business days. Okay, so what's the big deal? The big deal is that in the process of responding to this individual whom he does not like, the Corporation Counsel responsible for FOI requests in the city of Hartford accidentally copied the guy on an email that he had written to somebody else about how much he didn't like him. Forgetting what I just told you, that everything is a public record. Now, this is one that might not have seen the light of day had he not goofed, but I'm sort of a dinosaur when it comes to that stuff. I could have done it. So now in the hands of the requester, a journalist, is the following. And again, I'm going to clean it up, but you'll get the idea. Carl, so who lit a fire under this? It's a bad word that starts with an A. If he's involved in litigation, ongoing, and or other projects that he hasn't asked about, can I shut him down? So the response isn't really thank you for your request, it's your how do I get rid of you? He's a journalist. Boom, it's on the blog. It's on the public access TV thing. He's connected. FSB, 6 o'clock. Hartford calls, request, current the next morning, big headlines. Hartford looks really bad. I mean, you just don't do that. So the Corporation Counsel tries to fix it, tries to walk it back. City of Hartford letterhead. Trust me, that's what it is. In his letter of apology. But he can't do it. In his letter of apology is the following. Apparently you have little else to do other than to pester me in this office and other city departments. Recall that I do not work for you. The purpose of the FOIA statute is not to provide you a playground. Guys, even if you think it, don't write it. Again, everything becomes a public record. Again, it makes the rounds, it's in the current. Now that's the humorous part. The worst part is that because it was him and he felt so strongly, and believe me, I get it, he never bothered to look at what he was asking for. He said it's him, he gets nothing, and the next headline we see is Hartford loses at FOI Commission because none of the records were exempt. There was no reason not to give them to him, and they lost at the commission. They were ordered released. When you get requests for records, even ones that might be difficult, get the massive requests for records. One of the things we always recommend, and this isn't anywhere in the law, this is just our advice, have a conversation with the requester, even the difficult person. You would be surprised how often people ask for a ton of stuff, don't really know what they want, and you'd be surprised, and am I right? You can get them to narrow the scope of that request. What are you trying to find out? Now, technically, you're not supposed to ask them what they want it for. You say, I know I'm not supposed to ask this under the law, but if you help me, and by the way, you can charge them up to 50 cents a page. And if the cost of the copies is going to exceed $10, it can get up there pretty quickly. You can get your money up front without making a copy. So if you say, okay, you want to stick to this, give me the $250. Ooh, wait a minute, I don't want to do that. That's another way to have that conversation. You would be surprised how often and how well that worked. Yes, sir?
I think we can't selectively charge people.
No. You want a uniform policy when it comes to charging. Yes?
Tom, could you talk just a little bit about sometimes the misconception of the initial 4-day response versus providing the documents in a reasonable time frame, as well as staggering?
She's heard this before. The next thing I was going to say was, okay, the 4 days to respond, but that doesn't necessarily mean generate the records. A lot of people will come in and say, okay, you've got 4 days, give me the records. That's not how it works. 4 days to respond. Now, if the record is in an agenda or a set of minutes that's sitting right there, you give it to them right away. Your response time is fewer than 4 days. But the law actually says that you have to provide access to records promptly. Not immediately, but promptly. Anybody want to take a crack at that? What does that mean? Nobody knew what that meant. It went to court very early in the life of this law, and the court said, we've got your back on that one. Promptly means without undue delay. Well, there's no deadline there. It doesn't tell you anything, but it does give you sort of some leeway. And remember, interpretation, gray area. Only you know who's out sick. Only you know that there's a big, people marching in the registrar's office in the next week and they want something that they might be able to get in March. They'll get it in 2 days. It's going to take 2 weeks because you're up to here with the election, right? It depends on timing. It depends on who's there. It depends on where the records are stored. It depends on whether or not there needs to be any legal review of the records. And you frame your response as, okay, in this case, prompt is going to be, it's going to be 2 weeks.
I don't know if I was right or not, but in a former life, I was the chief operating officer of Access Health Connecticut. And we had lots of folks, and I've heard you before.
He came back, too. You heard it before? Yeah.
No, because knowing this stuff can keep you out of trouble. But I would actually call the people and negotiate, work with them on a time frame. And I'd be open and honest and say, hey, we have open enrollment for the next 2 months. I'm flat out. And lo and behold, 99% of the folks are, oh, okay, great. They had my number. It was an ongoing relationship, not a us versus them.
Right. That conversation is exactly what I was talking about. Have conversations with people. You'd be surprised. It doesn't always work. There are people who will be difficult, but you'd be surprised how often people really do just want information. They're not here to stick a finger in your eye. They're here to really try to find something out, work with them, and you'd be surprised how often it works. Yes, ma'am.
Is any request for documentation an FOI?
Yes, if somebody asks for records, now remember, not answering questions, but if somebody asks for an existing record, it technically becomes a Freedom of Information request. You don't have to, because the law says you can get access to the records. You don't have to say under FOI. You don't have to do that. Now, remember that you do not need to create records that don't exist. People will come in and ask for stuff that you don't have. They'll ask you for a list of things. They'll ask you, if you don't have it, you're not obligated to create it. You're not obligated to do research for people. Now, my definition of research as a layperson, unfortunately, doesn't necessarily jive with what the law says. The law is a little stricter, but it basically means that you don't have to do research. You don't have to try to figure out what they're looking for. Can you tell me if, and give me the records that might apply? You know, you have to. It has to be a specific request. They have to be able to get their hands on, you know, a record that is there, not a creation. I want to get back to the promptness thing. You know, people say, well, you're always going to side with the requester. In the last few years, we've had a lot of trouble with the state police. They're understaffed, they're undermanned, and up until a couple of weeks ago, they were coming in with a sort of a real rational reason why, believe it or not, a year was prompt, based on their volume of requests and where they get them from. When they hit 18 months, we told them, you got to figure it out. We get it, we understand, we believe you, but a year and a half is, so even, you know, it's what do they call exigent circumstances, whatever that is, they come into play. What makes the records part a little harder, and this is where, you know, we could sit here all night and talk about it, but you have to have a handle on what some of those exemptions are, some of those exclusions. When we say except as otherwise provided by any federal law or state statute, that means that if there's a federal law or a state statute on the books that says thou shalt not release, it's a record you can't give out. The problem, folks, is that there's no list of those records anywhere. There's absolutely no list. So you could call and I might know about it, but I might not. Anybody here from the education world? There's a federal law called the Family Educational Right to Privacy Act. It's called FERPA for short. And people go to boards of education and superintendents and they ask for these educational records, and that law is pretty strong. It says if that record identifies a student and it's an education record, you can't give it out. Overriding freedom of information, and you just can't give it out. Now we know that one exists, but there are others for all different kinds of records that are out there. My strongest advice is to take a look at the different statutes that deal with the records you keep and deal with on a regular basis, so that you know the town clerk statutes and things like that. Have an idea so that you know when somebody comes in and you're not kind of like, And the problem is, I think sometimes they don't know. A couple months ago, I took a call from a woman at the State Department of Education. She says, I've got a problem. And I said, what's the problem? She says, I'm being asked for a copy of this new report that boards of education have been mandated to create by this law that just went into effect. And I said, okay, what's the problem? She says, I think I can't give it out. I think the legislature said it's got to be confidential. So I look it up, and she's on the phone, and I said, oh, here it is right here, which shall create this report, which shall be confidential. She said, oh, that's a problem. I said, what's the problem? You've got it right. You have it right. She said, no, people are asking for it. I said, but you can't give it to them. Asking for copies of this new report are members of the legislative committee who wrote the law that made it confidential. So sometimes they don't even know, how are we supposed to know? So you want to make sure that you have at least a handle on the exceptions. Exclusions. The primary exclusion that we talk about is section 1-217. And that says that you don't give out the home address of certain individuals. Judges, correction officers, police officers. That law's gone around the block several times too. It doesn't apply to tax records. It doesn't apply to land records. And it doesn't apply to voting records. And that's a change that's within the last 6 years, or clarification. A simple example, on your zoning commission there's a police officer, and you know he's a police officer. Someone wants a roster, names and addresses. You would black out the home address of the police officer before you gave it out. The problem with that one used to be that they didn't have to tell you. You were supposed to kind of guess if somebody was in one of those categories, and now the law has been clarified. You need to tell people. And frankly, the other thing is, this was well-intentioned when it was written back in the late 90s. But the reality is you can pretty much find out that stuff. People aren't going to town halls to get addresses anymore. They're just going online and they're finding them. It's still in the law, but it's less and less impactful than it was before. The third of the 3 E's, and this is one where we could spend hours, and Durham awaits, so we won't, but it's section 1-210 of the FOI Act. And there are 28 exemptions in that third category. The exemptions are different from the first two. The first two are mandatory. The law says these are records that you shall not release. When you read section 1-210, it says these are records basically that you may not release. So you are allowed to withhold them, but not required to withhold them. So you've got to make two decisions. Do I give them out? Or let me back that up. Are they exempt? And do I want to give them out anyway? That's a tough call. I mean, you're sitting in a situation, and the records in those 28 categories cover a lot of things. You know, I mentioned the bids and the RFPs and the attorney-client privilege. The exemptions for personnel records are in there. The exemptions, the law enforcement exemptions are in there. The exemptions for trade secrets are in there. We talked about that a little bit. The exemptions for things that, if released, would be a safety risk. There's a large number of things in there. What you want to do, if you deal with the public and you deal with records, is to take a look at those exemptions so that you have some idea whether they might apply should somebody ask for the records that you're responsible for keeping. Let me tell you just a little bit about the personnel file exemption, which comes up all the time. The law says that you're allowed to withhold things in a personnel or medical file or a similar file, the disclosure of which would constitute an invasion of personal privacy. People who come to the public sector from the private sector are shocked to learn that even their personnel files are public records. They are. To not release something in a personnel file, you'd have to determine that releasing it would be an invasion of the person's privacy. That standard comes from a 1993 state Supreme Court case. It's called the Perkins decision. That case involved a teacher who objected to her attendance records. The court said the attendance records of all of us who work in the public sector are public, period, end of story. And then it said, to have been an invasion of that woman's privacy, it would have to have been highly offensive and not a matter of public concern. It would have to meet both prongs of the test. So what's supposed to happen is, somebody comes in, they want to see a personnel file. Let's just, for the sake of argument, Maria's in charge of the personnel file. She looks at it and she said, would releasing this be an invasion of this person's privacy? Would releasing it be highly offensive and not a matter of public concern? I'm sorry, and a matter of public concern. Would it meet both prongs? And if it does, she says, I think it's an invasion of privacy. She goes to the employee. The employee then says, I don't care, then out it goes. If the employee says, yes, that's right, that's an invasion of my privacy, then the record cannot be released until or unless the person making the request files a complaint with the FOI Commission, and the Commission says, sorry, Simsbury, you're wrong, there's no invasion of privacy there, give it out. You don't go to the individual until you determine there's an invasion of privacy, because going to the individual gives the individual the right to object. Let's suppose you go, the person objects, and then you look at it and say there's no invasion of privacy here, you're stuck, you can't give it out. The assumption is that the record would be given out unless it falls under one of those categories. Quick story to illustrate. Middletown had a situation with a police officer. He was rumored to be having all kinds of trouble at home. Rumors got so loud that they pulled him off the street, they put him on desk duty. They did an internal affairs investigation. They thoroughly investigate, and they decide, you know what? He's fine. He's doing a great job, put him back on the street. The Hartford Courant hears about this and wants to see the IA report. Now, an IA report is not automatically exempt. It's a public record. Middletown PD says there's an awful lot of detail about his trouble at home. He's having trouble at home, but it also says we're not going to give it out. So the current as is, it's right, files a complaint with the FOI Commission. The Commission looks at it and says, you know what, this details a lot of personal stuff. It would be highly offensive to tell the world about this guy's trouble at home. And it's not a matter of public concern because it says he's doing a great job and they put him back on the street. It meets both prongs of that test. The complaint was dismissed. It's not released, but it's got to meet both prongs of the test. You always want to have, common sense in mind too. Safety risk, things like that. If you look at a record and you got a question, you can either call, you can look at it, and you just make sure that it lines up with an exemption before you say no. But back to that first example, don't just say no because you don't want to or because you feel that, always have something that you can hook it up to so that you can invoke an exemption properly. Yes?
Is there an exact exemption when you're dealing with client files?
Is there an exact, what kind of an?
So I'm the social worker in the room.
Social worker in the room. I guess that could fall under medical records. That could fall under, precise record exemption, no. But you'd want to look at them and find one. There may also be a statute that governs some of those.
Yeah, a lot of our records are like financial records and personal records for clients.
Right, and again, there may be an exemption that lines up nicely with exactly what they are. Your instinct may be good, but look at them and see what lines up would be the best way to go. Yes, sir?
When would an exemption negate the entire record as opposed to redacting the record?
Well, the exemption would negate the entire record if it applied to the entire record, but redactions are certainly okay. Like, we've never ordered the release of a social security number, so if the whole record is okay except for the social, you'd black out the social and give the record out. Again, that's a judgment call. There are some records that are so heavily blacked out it makes no sense to give it out, and that's okay if it's legit, but that's a call that you would get to make. Any other records that you wanted to ask about or other questions? Yes, sir.
Following up, I think before on proposals, we received proposals for various projects. We've had competing firms ask for copies of that. Are they subject?
Okay. Are they RFPs?
RFPs.
Well, the exemption for RFP holds until you've given the contract, then you would give them out. Okay? So the competing firm can look after they've gotten the bid or not gotten the bid, but only after that. Yes?
If records used in a public system are encrypted by the users, is decryption required?
You'd have to make them available. That's a good question. The question was, would decryption be required? The answer would be yes. If it's a public record, you'd have to make it available. You have to make it accessible. There's a piece in section 1-212 that talks about the storage of records electronically, and it talks about making sure that you make the records accessible. So, we could spend literally hours talking about the different records and the different exemptions. The thing to remember is that you go back to the idea that everything is a public record. People say, well, I was working at home, right? No problem. If you're doing Simsbury business at home on your own laptop or your own, phone or whatever, that record, we're not going to come in and grab the laptop, but that record becomes a public record. It doesn't matter where you are when you create it. Yes, ma'am?
When we take meetings during the commission meeting, minutes, or during the commission meeting, we take minutes, our own notes, are those public records?
Question was notes. They are technically public records, but there's an exemption for personal notes. So I would say 99% of those personal notes would not be subject to, and you should see some of mine with the little faces and things like that. But they would not be unless they become the foundation for a more permanent record. Sometimes the notes slide into the file, so it's not a universal thing, but for the most part, your personal notes would not be disclosed. That's one of the first exemptions in the law. I took a call a couple months ago from a woman. She says, hi, my name is Sean. I said, hi, Sean, how are you? She said, good. She says, I'm calling you from Georgia. Who's calling the Connecticut FOI Commission from Georgia? She says, my husband is an out-of-state contractor, and he had a job in Connecticut last summer. And I think he had an affair with a state worker. Why is she calling me? It wasn't me. Why is she calling? She wants to see the worker's emails. She wants to see the worker's texts. She wants to see the phone records. Anything created in the conduct of that project's business Meet me at the construction trailer at 6 o'clock. We'll go over the blueprints, and then you know, ... Well, that's a public record, right? She said, thanks, it'll help me with my divorce. Always remember that when you're doing Simsbury business in writing, it's a public record. Electronic, you know, the old paper records, all of those things, they're public records. Be cognizant of that, know what the exemptions are, and be ready to, you know, make them available if you have to. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? Anything we didn't touch on that you wanted to ask about? Yes, sir.
Phone number?
Whose?
Yours.
Private, can't have it. No. You set me up. I walked through that one. Here's what I have. I brought these. I call these the Freedom of Information American Express card. Don't leave home without it. It's highlights of the FOI Act, okay? They're great for a wallet, a purse, a desk drawer. The phone number's on the back. It's a small agency. You call, you may get voicemail, but I will call you back. Do not ever hesitate to pick up the phone and call. I guarantee you, as soon as I walk out of here, you're going to think of something you should have asked. It's not a problem. I spend most of my time on my kids say I'm like a FOI telemarketer. I'm on the phone all the time. So don't hesitate to do that. Yes, sir.
Emails between board members that aren't most even allowed?
Are emails between board members allowed? I thought we just could escape without that conversation, but they are allowed to the extent of, where's the next meeting? I missed the last meeting, can you fill me in? But when you start having that deep deliberative conversation that you should be having at the table, then you're having a problem. A lot of board chairs don't like their board members to hit the old reply all thing. It could be a very dangerous thing. Board chairman sends something out that says, this is how, and remember, when we talk about meetings, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, so you could conceivably meet over the phone or meet, you don't want to do that, it's illegal. Chairman sends something out and says, this is what I think we need to do on this budget item. That's fine, okay? Take it, bring it to the next meeting. But inevitably what happens is somebody says, Mr. Chairman, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, and touches off a discussion via email that you should be having at the table. Be very, very careful the extent to which you do that, would be my advice. Yes, sir.
The question I'll be very using email. A lot of times the committee will have at the meeting, there'll be a question comes up where it's sort of left in the middle, like we need a price on something. And the committee will say, why don't you email us the information when you get it? Can you?
You can email the information, but don't vote on it.
They can't vote on it.
Don't vote on it. You have to vote at a public meeting. Do not vote on it via email. That's bad. I have a colleague from Virginia who stands up in front of groups like this and says, hi, my name's Maria. Email bad, because it can get you into trouble. One more? You had one more?
Well, about emails, we used to have people come in and ask for years of emails, not board related, just normal course of business, and we would pull them out and ship them off.
You make them available if they're not exempt. There is a new law that just went into effect as of October 1st, Public Act 18-95. One of the problems with our law, and I'm going to have to close on this, probably not the best thing to close on, is that people have started using our law as a weapon, as a means of getting back at people, as a political tool, things like that. We don't want that. That's not what this law is about. This law is really important to making sure that democracy works. So this has been an ongoing problem, and we worked with the legislature to sort of approve, get language for this law. Basically, it's an act concerning appeals under the FOI petitions for relief from vexatious requesters. And it strengthens the FOI Commission's ability to say no to someone who wants a hearing, like that clown that guy that I told you about with the 450 complaints. He sent us a letter the other day. I know it's in outer space somewhere. Anyway, but it also gives the town a vehicle, a tool to say, you know what? This person's asked for the same damn thing 15 times. We've supplied it the first 14 enough. And the town can petition the FOI Commission for help. And if the commission agrees with the town or the public agency, state agency, it can say, you know what, we agree, and it can stop the person from actually making a request to that agency for up to a year. Now, this law just went into effect. I have no, I mean literally October 1st. I have no idea how it's going to fly. But stay tuned. And that recognizes the fact that some people have done the sort of thing that they're just doing it to aggravate, and that's not good.
Inefficient.
Yeah. Folks, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.